Good evening. It is January 19th, 2022. Welcome to tonight's DEI Committee of the Guilderland Central School District. We'll start our meeting with the Pledge of Allegiance. If you'll join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. So tonight's meeting starts with approval of our minutes from the last meeting, which was on December 15th. Anybody have any comments? All right, Elizabeth?
Oh, I thought it said, maybe I have notes somewhere, but they're over there. I think it said that the audit committee was at a standstill or something. Was that correct? I don't remember that being the case. I thought it was like they were in the middle of doing something.
I think we'll talk more about the audit committee tonight, but at last meeting, we were at the point where we didn't have anybody to specifically work with externally, and we were kind of doing some research on that piece of it. But any other thoughts on the minutes from last meeting? All right, motion to accept. Mirzad. And second, Kelly, all in favor? Thanks, everyone. All right, moving on to the agenda items for tonight, report from the subcommittees. We'll start tonight with the communications subcommittee. Who would like to give that report?
So Amy, Maxine is wrapping up with another activity, so maybe we circle around the end of these reports.
Yeah.
We plan to give the report.
Okay, no problem. We can do community engagement first.
So I have volunteered to give the report tonight, and we had a fabulous conversation with our engagement committee around cultural festivals and how we could try to incorporate some celebrations around cultures here at Guilderland. And there was some really robust conversation that was had about what they mean, how they should be executed, and how it could be an opportunity to create something that's a little bit more innovative. So some of the key points that we discussed were students who may not see their culture as different enough to be included in a cultural festival or celebration, children that also their identities, because of the ways that they got to the United States, whether it be slavery, whether it be that they were already here, indigenous, and then things that happened in our history, that they may feel that their culture might be commodified or might not be included enough or different enough to be included, things like that. So we had a couple conversations around how you can mitigate that, but that was a clear point of contention from the beginning. How do we not tokenize cultures? And how do we not tokenize students that are from specific cultures as well? Also talking about the celebration of our American culture as a convergence, as a place where all different cultures could come to converge. So talking about the beauty of inclusion that can happen here in America and how that has really woven a different fabric than has ever been seen in the world before because of all the different cultures that have converged here in the United States. We talked about allowing for students to self-select if they wanted to participate as educators or as participants like audience, as those who are educated. And then we also had a conversation around how do we bring this to the community? How do we make it fun for not just our student populations, but our families to get involved? We threw around some ideas around, creating a passport and having raffles and having each school building maybe represent a different continent, and that, widening the inclusivity of it. So there were a lot of wonderful ideas of how we could think about a cultural festival in ways that haven't been necessarily done before, and that don't just elevate maybe cultures of recent immigrants into our country, but really have a more holistic view because sometimes what we talked about is that cultural festivals and initiatives like this tend to focus on kind of more othering, like what's different. And we wanted to take the approach of, okay, let's celebrate our differences, but let's have a capstone that also integrates how our American culture has provided this opportunity for all of these wonderful different people, different traditions to come and coexist and be viable and be celebrated. So I don't know if I did a good job, but we have extensive notes, but that's pretty much what we discussed. And I welcome anyone else in the committee to chime in.
All right, Mirzad and then Elizabeth.
I was just gonna say I really like that idea. I think that's a great opportunity. Like two follow-ups to that though? How are you thinking about doing? Like, are you thinking about doing it like the cultural fair at the high school, or like a different format? Or and then I was gonna this is a shameless plug for Westmere, but I remember back in 5th grade we had the Heritage Project, and I thought that was great, and I learned a lot about myself and my identity. Or is that a thing across all of our elementary schools? Is that more unified to Westmere?
I can speak to the first question. We spent a lot of time discussing how we can make this a program intentional and inclusive and different. Did we arrive at what the exact format is going to be? No, everybody threw out a lot of great and different ideas, but we had robust conversations on making sure that things were inclusive, that we weren't othering folks, how we communicated the events to the community and to the student population. We wanted it to be a little bit different from what the high school is already doing, and more district-wide than just the high school. So that's why we were throwing out some ideas of maybe each school building has a region of the world that they really focus in. So that way we're not just thinking about our own personal cultures, but we're also really pushing the limits of learning about a different region of the world and cultures that you might not normally think about. And then we also had the discussion around, looking at what's already represented in the Guilderland community and making sure that those different cultures that are already in the Guilderland community are also uplifted in that. So we wanted to make a multi-pronged approach, but we didn't spend as much time on the how. We spent a lot of time on the why and what and kind of what we wanted to do, but really the why it's important.
Thanks, Tibisai. Elizabeth?
Tibisai, tell me if this is wrong, but I just wanted to add to what you said, that my understanding was that the way that came up, the idea of changing the notion of how a cultural fair works. Like a cultural fair traditionally has been, okay, come to Guilderland, wear a costume from the place where your ancestors are from, and make food from there, and tell us about the place. So that's kind of like the model of a cultural fair. But for some people on the subcommittee, they don't have any knowledge of where their family came from generations ago before they were in America. So, slavery, for instance, was a rupture of taking them from wherever it was they came from before and bringing them here. And so they have no way to reach back and say, okay, here's the country in Africa where my ancestors came from. They don't know. So it's impossible to celebrate a culture since you don't know what it is. And so those people just have no real option of what to do, and they feel sort of left out. But wasn't that kind of the idea of how the conversation came about? So that was where we got the idea of maybe saying some people could, they could pick a country. They could, instead of telling everybody about that country, they could decide to be a learner about some other country. So there was more options for what you could do, more roles you could play, and that was where also the idea came up of really changing the whole notion of the cultural fair. So it's not sharing your own background, but maybe everybody is a group of people are all studying this country, And some people might want to share their culture, and that they could do that, other people could learn. So anyway.
And one of the things that we talked about at the end was maybe this ignites something around genetics in Guilderland, right? So there are ancestry organizations that partner with schools to create genetics type of clubs, like students that might be interested in the science behind, like the STEM parts of how we're learning about where people's ancestry is from and their backgrounds and things like that. So the conversation started at one point, but it really expanded into, a lot of different ways that this type of topic could be incorporated holistically within the school district.
All right.
Well, the Heritage Project, and also, of course, just people, we can't assume that everybody has access to doing things like, sending off their DNA. So, I don't know. I never heard of the Heritage Project, so I'm curious what that was.
So we'll leave that as a question. Dee, did you want to speak up as someone from Westmere?
I can answer the question about the Heritage Project. Historically at Westmere, grade 5 has studied used the social studies curriculum, and each student that connected with a culture spent the year connecting the social studies curriculum to that culture. So it was like a parallel project that lasted the entire year, which culminated in the Heritage Project celebration, which included cross-curricular support from music to art to food. Mirzad, I don't remember exactly. You were longer than my experience with it. My son did it. They do posters. They do a presentation. They dress in that culture. And 2020, because of COVID, it obviously didn't happen. And then from that time forward until last year when they rethought it, I can't speak for them. I know that they were considering something just more culturally responsive because there may be students that don't have a connection or that do. And so the inclusivity of it was kind of, they wanted to respect that. So I think they're just trying to come up with something different.
Thanks, Dee. I appreciate it. I think that's really helpful. I think all this history is really good. We actually have a couple of weighty things on the agenda tonight, so we're going to keep the subcommittees to a report. And if anybody has more detail, we can ask short questions, but if anybody has more detailed questions, we can always feel free to reach out to the subcommittees. Barb, did you have a quick question for engagement?
Very, very quick.
Okay.
The other groups of people that we were concerned about are children that may have been adopted that didn't know their history, kids that may be in foster care that, again, didn't know their history. So, there were a number of children that we were concerned about. That's it.
Yep, I appreciate that. I think there's, a lot of concern there to make sure that everybody is able to access it. Thank you to Basai for the report. Much appreciated. On to the research committee. Who's making that report today?
I'll go real quick. The research committee, we have a new member, Victoria, and we met with Victoria and Matthew last week. That asked us to take over some research around the background we discussed in the land acknowledgement, making sure we understood who were the tribes that were here, were and are here, how could we contact someone there and perhaps get an idea of their understanding around these issues. So we took the first step and I sent over today kind of a background of 3 different potential tribal nations we might want to make contact with. And I apologize if I'm saying the wrong word between nations and tribes. I've definitely learned a lot during the research, but the point is to make our next step out. And we also learned a lot of interesting things about the migration of some of these groups and their struggles for land rights So that could also be an interesting thing for us to look into further as we discuss land acknowledgements. So that will, I think, eventually be handed off to the communication committee to for outreach to reach out to these governmental entities, perhaps tribal entities. And then we also, so I'm sorry for stumbling over the words, but I realized today I don't know as much as I thought I knew. So that is why I am trying to speak from cultural humility on this issue. Secondly, we are worked a lot with Victoria to talk about the social studies curriculum and changing our focus a little bit from adding something DE&I related to the curriculum and instead reaching out to teachers to see, is there a lesson plan you've been interested in teaching but are nervous to teach or would like some support on how to teach. So we're really coming from a place of not adding to their plate or giving a directive, but asking how we can support them in DE&I curriculum. And we also thought about doing that in the enrichment space as well. So those are kind of two projects we are managing.
That's awesome. Thanks, Leo. Looks like you guys are doing a nice deep dive. Any quick questions for the research committee? Mike?
No questions, but Leah, I'd be interested in the contacts. I'd totally reach out on behalf of the communication subcommittee if you want me to make some contact to the tribal nations.
Great, I'll forward you the email.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. All right, the audit committee. I'll give a brief overview of our meeting, and then please feel free to jump in, anybody else from the audit committee. So we really talked about the role of the committee. At this point, we are looking at doing an external audit, using an outside person to actually be conducting the audit. So we saw the role of the audit committee at this point to really be the people who are interfacing with the auditor, so we can have conversations with them about who we are and help give them direction and give them some context to why. And then we also saw our role as possibly connecting with staff to help prepare them for the idea of the audit. So I know we were working with the staff on the audit committee, Matt and Dee, to look at how can we work with our building admin to make sure that we're supporting our building admin and also our staff, and anything that we can be doing as a committee to help prepare our staff for those conversations and the fact that the audit is going to happen, because we know that there's going to be some difficult conversations even before we get to the point of the audit happening. So we wanted to voice that we're a group of support for building staff and admin as we're embarking on this. And we talked about making sure that all voices are valued, not just the ones who are jumping in head first into the audit, but we want to make sure that that people are heard in their thoughts and concerns therein. So we talked about how we could go about supporting and look at how we can interface with the leadership team, interface with the staff on that, and then also getting some questions together for when we meet with possible external people to do the audit. Committee members, anything I'm missing? Something I didn't include?
Excuse me.
Or any questions for the audit committee? Barb?
Just a quick one. Have you got an estimated cost if you were to pursue this?
We have not, as a subcommittee, gotten an estimated cost. I think that's something that at the district leadership level, we'd be working with them. Dr. Riles, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's more of a role of the district leadership?
Ultimately, yes. I guess the other question to consider is, would we be doing an RFP? What's the process for finding out who's available in the broader community who does this kind of work, and how would we, gather insight into how they do the work, when they would do the work, the cost, and all of those things. So we probably should circle around and talk about the process for seeking out someone to engage to help us.
I think that's a good idea. We had a conversation in our subcommittee about initially doing some research into some different companies and people that are available to perform the audit, and how we didn't want to just go by what's publicly available on their website, because that was always going to be positive reviews, et cetera, but maybe get some references. So I'm wondering if maybe other districts within the BOCES perhaps have some experience with that, and maybe can give us some references so that we can use the references rather than that publicly available information. Nicole?
And I was also just wondering if there's any research schools or colleges in the area that may want to take on too, so that could maybe prohibit some cost. I'm looking forward to that.
There might be. Dr. Rouse, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, but I think it would, if this is the direction we want to go, to look for someone external to the organization, the school district, to help us with this. You know, we should schedule some kind of a meeting or time to talk about what that would look like and how we would solicit that interest from an outside agency in doing the work. I know there's connections through Cap Region BOCES, and we've had referrals through other school districts who have done this kind of work, but we would need to, you know, settle on a fair and appropriate process. So the selection of an outside entity is done following our purchasing procedures.
Yep. Sounds good. We'll reach out and have that conversation. Anything else for the audit committee? All right, communications.
Sorry, 1 second. Let me just get it pulled up.
Sure.
So we met, we had a lot of ideas floating around that sort of had some loose ends. So our meeting was basically to get our priority goals lined up and figure out what we want to focus on. Our big focus that we want to work on is a DEI award, and we discussed how this award would be executed, and we want to have one for each level, the elementary school, middle school, and high school. And for the elementary school level, there would be one winner per building, and we want to try to incorporate this in with the P2 project that's been implemented at the K through 8 level. And and a big emphasis was on students that aren't traditionally recognized for awards. So students who make this part of their day-to-day life, maybe students that aren't doing big projects but have integrated it into their culture and how they present themselves. And it would be a great way to make award ceremonies more meaningful. And we would be using the social justice standards that Mr. Pinchnot provided for us. And we are interested in making it a peer-nominated award at the high school level, and then at the elementary school and middle school level, a teacher-nominated award. And we want to talk to the Board of Education about expanding the award recognition. And this is something that we are aiming for next school year. So we'll spend the rest of the year promoting this and getting everything ironed out so that this can be a really successful award and a really great way to promote our ideals and like new DEI standards within the district.
Sounds great, Maxine. Thank you. Any questions for that committee? Great work.
Amy, I'll just jump in to say, you know, the Board of Education has been talking about looking at our criteria for the Board of Ed awards. And we wondered on the committee if this was an opportunity to weave in some of our DEI priorities into the Board of Ed award going forward. So just an idea, but planting the seeds that maybe that's a direction to go as we pursue that.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, so moving on to the next agenda item, I'm going to pass it over to Matt Pinchnot for the TED Talk with Clint Smith.
Good evening, everyone. Just definitely wanted to start by saying thank you for everyone with the amazing work happening in all of our subcommittees. Truly, without all the work happening there, I think that we wouldn't be able to be nearly as effective here. So I know that that's where, you know, the meat and potatoes, so to speak, of our work is happening. So one of my favorite moments of any week is going to those meetings. So I really, really appreciate the work that's happening. Now, for this component, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And something that, as we start this new calendar year, something that's really been stirring within me, it's the idea of using our voices. So when we closed out 2021, we did a little bit of a review and a look back over the year and seeing what are some of the highlights that we've had, what are some of the best moments. And those best moments, something that they shared, they were moments where we used our voice. There were moments where we stood up, where we spoke out, and where we took action based off of what we saw. And Clint Smith is an author and educator, poet that I really respect and enjoy. And so we in the steering committee thought that it might be fitting to take a look at just a quick clip from him tonight before we even go into our learning component for tonight. As a bridge between the learning component and also as an advanced organizer, so to speak, using teacher jargon, for work that we'd like to have happen this year. And a reminder that using our voices is not just something that we should do, but I personally believe that as members of this committee, it's something that we are almost compelled to do in the circumstances that we can have them. Now, the last thing I'll say before playing this clip is that we also are compelled to use our voice and model after what students are doing. We have so many students doing amazing work, and I said I would do this, so I'm going to. I just want to work a quick shout out into our meeting for the students who planned the anti-hate rally last year. A group of them was able to present at a conference for the entire capital region last weekend. They dedicated hours of their Saturday to doing so, and hours beforehand planning a presentation that would engage teachers and students and higher ed folks in conversations around activism and using their voices. So as much as this has been something that I've seen personally reflected in me and something I've been thinking about, it's something that I saw modeled by our students. And with that said, I'll let Clint Smith do the talking from here.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in a 1968 speech where he reflects upon the civil rights movement, states, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." As a teacher, I've internalized this message. Every day all around us, we see the consequences of silence manifest themselves in the form of discrimination, violence, genocide, and war. In the classroom, I challenge my students to explore the silences in their own lives through poetry. We work together to fill those spaces, to recognize them, to name them, to understand that they don't have to be sources of shame. In an effort to create a culture within my classroom where students feel safe sharing the intimacies of their own silences, I have 4 core principles posted on the board that sits in the front of my class, which every student signs at the beginning of the year. Read critically, write consciously, speak clearly, tell your truth. I find myself thinking a lot about that last point, tell your truth. And I realized that if I was going to ask my students to speak up, I was going to have to tell my truth and be honest with them about the times where I failed to do so. So I tell them that growing up, as a kid in a Catholic family in New Orleans, during Lent, I was always taught that the most meaningful thing one could do was to give something up. Sacrifice something you typically indulge in to prove to God you understand His sanctity. I've given up soda, McDonald's, French fries, French kisses, and everything in between. But one year, I gave up speaking. Figured the most valuable thing I could sacrifice was my own voice, but it was like I hadn't realized that I had given that up a long time ago. I had spent so much of my life telling people the things they wanted to hear instead of the things they needed to. Told myself I wasn't meant to be anyone's conscience because I still had to figure out being my own, so sometimes I just wouldn't say anything. Appeasing ignorance with my silence, unaware that validation doesn't need words to endorse its existence. When Christian was beat up for being gay, I put my hands in my pocket and walked with my head down as if I didn't even notice. Couldn't use my locker for weeks because the bolt on the lock reminded me of the one I had put on my lips when the homeless man on the corner looked at me with eyes up, merely searching for an affirmation that he was worth seeing. I was more concerned with touching the screen of my Apple than actually feeding him one. When the woman at the fundraising gala said, "I'm so proud of you. It must be so hard teaching those poor, unintelligent kids," I bit my lip because apparently we needed her money more than my students needed their dignity. We spend so much time listening to the things people are saying that we rarely pay attention to the things they don't. Silence is the residue of fear. It is feeling your flaws, gut-wrench guillotine your tongue. It is the air retreating from your chest because it doesn't feel safe in your lungs. Silence is Rwandan genocide. Silence is Katrina. It is what you hear when there aren't enough body bags left. It is the sound after the noose is already tied. It is charring. It is chains. It is privilege. It is pain. There is no time to pick your battles when your battles have already picked you. I will not let silence wrap itself around my indecision. I will tell Christian that he is a lion, a sanctuary of bravery and brilliance. I will ask that homeless man what his name is and how his day was, because sometimes all people want to be is human. I will tell that woman that my students can talk about transcendentalism like their last name was Thoreau. And just because you watch one episode of The Wire doesn't mean you know anything about my kids. So this year, instead of giving something up, I will live every day as if there were a microphone tucked under my tongue, a stage on the underside of my inhibition. Because who has to have a soapbox when all you ever needed is your voice? Thank you.
So I'm gonna let us sit with that for a second and process that. As we're thinking, I'm gonna pose a question. How does the message of this talk relate to and inform our work moving forward? What are the times when we've allowed a bolt to be placed on our lips? And how do we see ourselves as a vehicle, not to provide, but to amplify the voices of those who far too often been marginalized? And beyond that, what are our gut reaction to his words? Yes, Amy.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen that talk a couple times now, and every time I see it, it is you talk about gut reaction, it's a gut punch because it's so relatable. And to me, the fact that it's relatable means that there are a lot of times that we choose not to use our voice. And I think to me, that's the lesson to learn is, sometimes I say, when you're making a decision, you always want to be able to put your head on the pillow at night or look at yourself in the mirror. And to me, that's the lesson of this TED Talk is use your voice because you need to, so that you're not punching yourself in the gut, right? And giving yourself that reaction.
Mike.
Just to follow up with Amy, I think that how does this inform our work? I think the power of it is it gives scenario examples of initial reactions and then alternative reactions that align with our work. So, if we can somehow communicate the message of, look, when I initially looked at this scenario, when I initially looked at this situation, my gut reaction was this. However, there was also these other options. So when he speaks about sort of his, giving the apple versus, ignoring versus, so how can we provide examples for our students and our staff where, hey, you're faced with this scenario, you could it's almost like a choose your own ending book. Pick A, pick B. But at least there's an awareness of there's a B and a C. You know what I mean? I don't know.
I really appreciate you saying that, and I'm drawing, and I'm thinking back to engagement subcommittee meeting earlier this month, and a lot of what Tivis I shared. The genesis of it was with this. Elizabeth brought that up too, but it was about OSU in something that I'll admit, I'll put myself on the line where I was just like, this is a great thing, and I only was seeing one lens where this was a celebration. Where for some folks, it wasn't a celebration, it was a calling out, and it was an exposition. And so, yeah, I think part of using our voices in this light means revisiting things where we have a good intent and seeing what's the impact of what we're doing. And one of the great things that I think exists with this committee is that we're going to put the time in to be able to do that and put the effort in because we know it's a process and that our understanding today won't be as good as our understanding next week, next month, certainly not next year. And that using our voice, it really means committing ourselves to learning and relearning. Does anyone else have any thoughts or reflection on that before we go to the learning component for tonight? Gloria, then to decide.
I'm in the middle of reading the book 1619, and having been 38 years a history teacher, having, quote, taught American history, I have been just gut punched by this book. Every chapter I read, I thought I knew, but knowing on a surface level is not knowing at all. When you read the words from the heart of people that walked these stories, that lived these stories, I can't tell you how powerful reading this book has been, and how it just changes how you look at people, at things in the world. You can't help but change. It's a powerful story. And that story needs to be not only read, told.
Thank you for that. To the side, then Leah.
I'm so shook I couldn't even unmute. Sorry. So when I've seen this a couple times as well, and when I first saw it, I had this visceral reaction to it because I felt like there were things like safety and not feeling safe to speak and people being silenced that weren't considered within the context of my initial viewing of this. And then I started thinking about the work that I do, that we're trying to do. And I remember being in meetings where I've been the only one to say, I don't think this is right, or this should be considered in a different way. And every time I'm the initiator, but then there's always like 2, 3, 4 people that then come out of the woodwork that completely agree. So I think that there's this bravery of being the first, and allowing and giving permission to individuals that may be thinking the same thing as you, but, might feel like they're silenced. And I give a lot of props to Elizabeth because I feel like she 100% embodies this so much within this committee. Since we're giving shout outs, I'm so grateful for Elizabeth. And when she brings up hard topics and says hard things that we need to talk about. So I'm constantly inspired by that. But yeah, just that when you make the decision to be brave, you unconsciously sometimes are giving permission to others to also speak. And that's really motivating and powerful, and something that I think we should be teaching students. I also think about family structures, and I think about our students. When you're a child, you are a subordinate to your parent. You're always in a subordinate state. So how do we create spaces where they feel empowered, but also where we teach our students to be respectfully empowered. I think that's an important nuance to this. It's yes, speak your truth, but there are ways to speak that truth that can connect with your audience in emotional ways and intellectual ways. And I think sometimes we don't really think through or give such great examples as this video showed as to how you can do that in a manner that is not just respectful, but also gets the outcome that your desired outcome. And I'm always thinking about that whenever I'm presenting, like, what's my desired outcome and how can I express this story in a way, or this narrative in a way that's going to allow for there to be some transfer of knowledge, but also a vulnerability that allows for people to feel like they were seen and were a part of the experience with me, and not just being spoken to about something that's foreign to them. So that's what was brought up for me.
Absolutely. I love that. Thank you. We have then Amy and then Seema.
Thanks. I think what struck me when the young man began speaking, he had he spoke in a way that I used to speak when I was a kid, and for which I was sent to speech therapy and cured of it. And I'm going through now. My son has dysfluency. He's a stutter, and he is in speech therapy in the district. And I loved my therapist when I was a kid, but now I really love the approach they're taking around. We're not trying to cure him. We're teaching him to be confident. We're teaching him to speak no matter what. And really, part of our job here is helping the kids. What we've been learning about in this book we've reading of not seeing as a deficit. We're teaching all the kids and giving them all an opportunity to speak different languages, what may be seen as a speech disability, accents, whatever it is, speaking through a neurodiverse way. We're teaching all of those kids that they have a right to use that voice, and that there's still a lot to be said. It doesn't have to be delivered in a certain message or package to be valid or worth listening to. So that really strikes me as sort of the inner what I've learned so much about in this committee is stop thinking about things from a deficit standpoint.
Yeah, I think that's critical. That's absolutely critical. Amy and then Seema.
Yeah, I think another thing that really resonates with me when I watch that is that it's a moment for self-evaluation about the space that you take up in a room. And so, oftentimes those who have a tendency not to speak, it's an encouragement to speak up. But I also think it's a really good moment to say, how much space do you allow yourself to take up in a room? And sometimes people need to, do that self-evaluation to realize that they should be taking up more space in a room. And sometimes people need to do a self-evaluation to realize they need to do the opposite. And so I do think another lesson from this is a point of self-reflection.
Thank you. My self-reflection is to take up less. I'm trying. I'm working.
Not at all, Matt.
No.
Not at all. Never.
Seema.
What struck me when I listened to it was the idea of when we're silent and how we kind of rationalize why we were silent. When he talks about staying silent because we needed to, get money or funding for whatever, or I've heard in different cases where I didn't say anything, I didn't want it to impact my grade, or I didn't want to be a troublemaker. And sometimes that may be true, and sometimes it might just be what we tell ourselves, so we can kind of, live with ourselves at that point. So Mike's comment about the having options B and C, and maybe reflecting on what could I have said, or what can I say the next time around, that struck me.
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything you wanted to share before we go to the learning component? Absolutely. Absolutely. And so I think that this is a good bridge into section 9 of this chapter, where This has been something we've been working towards for a while. And I think that we are I think it just is a very good thing that we're taking our time going through, because that just means the conversations have been rich. And I would always rather take our time as opposed to rushing through just for the purpose of saying we covered this. More important than covering it is diving into it. And so for folks who are watching now, maybe watching later, the section that we're going to cover tonight is about exploring religion as a form of identity. And this is a very, very salient topic for us to look at right now, especially in light of recent events, like the hostage situation that happened in Texas and the synagogue. And while that was in Texas and in Dallas, what does that mean? How do we as a community respond when we see folks hurting and folks in our community hurting for something that's happening that's impacting them and their loved ones and their feelings of safety, as was mentioned earlier. So the first area for questions I'd like for us to think about, kind of springboarding off of that, is in page 109 with the pause and reflect questions. We'll use that third bullet. And the bullet says, how would you describe the climate in your school for students from the religious minority? And it goes on to specify those who are atheists or agnostics. And I think for folks who are working outside of our buildings, we can also think about the broader community. So I wanted to start with the hard question, because this is one where I think it's important for us to use our voice. But again, so how do we describe the climate in your school for students from the religious minority, whatever that might look like? Nicole and then Maxine.
What was interesting to me was how we even started this meeting with the Pledge of Allegiance. And then the same thing, thinking again about the schools and how much schools, I believe, since I've been in school, that there's been a trying to be more open to saying certain words in the pledge, or just at least being present but not having to recite. And I would be very interested, and I'm glad Maxine raised her hand, about what it's like now in schools for people that may not believe in a higher power or God, or feel like they're not able to. The Jehovah's Witness was a good example of not being able to stand for the pledge and how that's handled.
Thank you, and that, I think, is a very, very interesting point to bring up. So Maxine, you can speak to that, whatever else you wanted to say, and then we'll go to Mike Laster.
I am a student in the religious minority. I'm Jewish, and I find that it puts me in very awkward situations at times, because I'm like one of the only Jewish kids on like my sports teams, and it puts me in the position of I don't want a coach to ever tailor anything specifically around one athlete. But I've had instances where we've had really important practices or time trials, so where you need a time to go to like a race, and I can't go because I have a high holy holiday, and it puts it in an awkward position. I feel as though it's very indifferent. I feel as though I'm not accommodated for or like specifically put down. It's just like a sort of neutral area where it's just there. Like time trials happen on high holy holidays, and it's just something that like unfortunately like I have to deal with, because again it's the balance of like it's one person versus it's one person, but like you should have been paying attention to.
Thank you. Kind of sitting with that feeling of indifference. Mike Laster.
I guess from my perspective as a building leader for a few years, I think there are parameters and things within the public educational system that prohibit us from respecting and including all of the different religions that are represented in our school communities. And while this is not a segue into the next agenda item, the next agenda item is an example of one of the parameters that as a building leader, I have to adhere to. While, we make it, in terms of a pledge, the Pledge of Allegiance, students do have the ability not to, stand, not to, that has been through case law and that has been through the courts. I think developmentally appropriateness is a question. How you handle that at the K-5 level, how you handle that at the 6-8 level, how you handle that at the 9-12 level is going to look differently. And I think that's appropriate. I think that, at least in our school district, we try to accommodate as much as possible. We provide alternative settings for folks who have to pray during the school day. We provide alternative curriculums for students whose religious beliefs don't allow them to listen to music or participate in musical activities. So I do think when we're aware of those circumstances, we work with parents and with district leadership to try to provide those alternatives. But there are some things that are outside of our control as a K-12 public school system. And frankly, that's frustrating because that goes back to our systemic racism conversation from a few meetings ago.
Thank you, Mike. Kim and then Elizabeth.
Hey, kind of a little bit piggybacking off of what Mike had just said. I feel like it's almost the fear, people say it's the fear of the unknown. I feel like in our district it's the fear of the little known, because there are a lot of people that really just aren't familiar. And just from conversations that I've had, and I'll stick to just like the PTA level going across the board, some people just don't know. And then there's that fear of asking about certain religions because there's the fear of, am I going to insult them? Am I going to ask the wrong thing? So sometimes it's just best to not ask at all. I feel like the district is a work in progress right now. I mean, the calendar was actually a good point too, because I looked at that earlier, because I know we've added Juneteenth. I know that there was a request to add another date as well, but I feel like a lot of us are just stuck in the we've always done it that way, and the fear of, like I said, the little known of, are we allowed to actually ask these questions? Should we venture out? And I mean, just a small example, I remember when we first came into the school a couple years in, I had asked about Diwali, and I was told that, oh, we don't really touch on that one because it's so different that it's just easier not to talk about that, because we do have quite a diverse community. So it was just the fear of, okay, it's too different. We haven't done it, so.
I think that's really powerful thing, the fear of the little known. Elizabeth?
Yeah, I was wondering, reading this part of the book where it talks about how in recent years, people who in the United States who describe themselves as strongly religious, Christians or whatever, that's kind of declined, and the numbers of other groups have grown. I think that decline of the strength of strong Christianity for a lot of people is kind of a scary thing, just as is the rise of more diverse groups who are insisting on having a voice. I think all of that is cause for fear among some people in this country. But when I read in the book the statistics on how big are groups like the number of Jews in the country is like 2% or whatever it was, and then the number of Hindus, the percent is like 1 or something. Wasn't it, I think? And I was just wondering if I know in Guilderland we track ethnicity, race. We have that all on our about the district, and we see all the pie graph, pie chart. Do we chart religion, or belief systems or whatever you call them. I mean, we would have a very different what do we call it? A very different, I think, makeup than what's described in this book. I think we'd be a lot more diverse than what's in this book. So I was just curious.
I'll jump in there, Matt. No, we don't track that data. It's not a data point collected by any of the entities that we report data to, like the State Education Department or various federal agencies. But ironically, we have been talking about how do we get a handle on what the makeup of our school community is in terms of religion. And the only way to find that out really would be to ask people. And, haven't done that yet. Is it something that we should be doing? And what would that look like? What would that sound like? How would it be received? Are all questions kind of up in the air.
Thank you for explaining that. Barb?
Just a quick follow-up to Maxine's concern about the sports program. In my mind, there is no reason under the sun why time trials should have been done on one of the Jewish holidays. As a district, we have, I know, tried our best to, not have testing going on, say during Ramadan and during special holidays that we're aware of, and particularly for a sports team when you're practicing 5 days a week. To have time trials on a religious holiday, to me, is crazy. So I think that can very easily be addressed through our coaches. And it's just nice that, we've been alerted to it. And I suspect it will never happen again.
Yeah, I appreciate it. My coach was very genuine. He did apologize to me, but it's just an example of how these things, it wasn't a hateful act. It was just an indifference. It just slipped his mind, and it was like an honest mistake. And it just shows that, it's just a feeling of there's nothing good or bad.
Yeah, that plays kind of middling. Leah?
So I don't want to, I'm not a student in the school or an adult in the school, so I can't speak to what the climate is. But it does strike me that the conversation we had with an educator on our meeting was about her nervousness to teach a book about, I believe it was a Hindu holiday, and she didn't want to pronounce the words wrong, and kind of made her want to maybe not do a different book instead or something. And it just sort of strikes me that religion, there's a continuum of how we're talking earlier, and Elizabeth mentioned, you can say everybody wear a costume and bring a food and listen to your favorite song, and that can feel sort of emotionally easy or unscary to engage in a culture, whereas religion and worldviews can probably feel the most daunting and the most fear of messing up, offending. I mean, we're talking about someone's holy beliefs, or if they're not part of an organized religion, even less understanding of where the boundaries are. So I think it strikes me that it's very easy to kind of oversimplify religion back into a discussion of food and clothes or what have you, and we're not. We talked a little bit about holidays or rules of you can and can't do, but to really get into these topics is going to help us understand worldviews and outlooks in a really profound way. But it is, it's not just do's and don'ts. It can really be an enriching conversation, but it is one of the scariest conversations to enter into.
I think that's a beautiful time, and we'll hear from Amy and then Seema, and we'll transition, kind of using that as a springboard into our second question. So Amy and then Seema.
Sure, thanks. Just to go back to your question about the climate in the school, I'll kind of echo some of what Maxine said about the neutral feeling, but I'll give some of my own, personal and my children's experiences as a parent. The holiday piece that Maxine talked about, there's the high holidays, which the district does make a really good effort to, not have classes, but there's, there are a lot of things that end up happening, not for bad intentions or anything like that, but there are things that do end up happening. I'm not going to touch the December dilemma. I'm going to kind of put that aside for now because that's a really long conversation in and of itself. But I'll point out like 3 really quick things that I think have been, interesting experiences for my kids. At GES at the elementary school level in 3rd grade, my kids have all done a culture book, which I think has really given them an opportunity, no matter what a student's culture is. Some of my kids, I think 3 of my 4 kids have focused on religion as part of that culture bit, and given them a chance to really talk about like family, food, celebrations, holidays, and like how they celebrate things without it being directed toward one particular religion or culture or celebration or another. So I think that's one helpful thing that's happened. And then 2 curriculum-related experiences that my kids have had. One is the idea of teaching religion as it is ancient history, and I think it's there's a balance there. But at one point it was conversation we had at home was, hey mom, it was taught today like we don't exist anymore, like we're an ancient civilization, like we're not here anymore. And that was interesting conversation to have at home, balancing that curriculum learning with where do we fit in the world today. And then a really ending with a really positive experience, again learning about Judaism as as it pertains to the curriculum. My daughter experienced a teacher who really took some feedback this year after she was in a lesson where there were some things that were taught that she had a lot of questions on that really didn't match her learning. She and the teacher had a really authentic conversation about the religion and about the difference between how you celebrate it and then how you teach it, and what are the things that are similar as a whole in the religion versus part of the different sects and different, how different people celebrate the religion. And I was really impressed, and my daughter was also really impressed at how the teacher was able to really hear this 14-year-old student who came to them and said, hey, I have a question about how you're teaching it. And so, I obviously as a mom, I was proud of my daughter, but I was really impressed and happy to see how the teacher really heard and took that feedback. So we do have some of those pockets of people who are really leaning in and listening. So that was a good experience.
Thank you. And thank you for being vulnerable and sharing your own personal family's narratives. Seema, and then we'll go to the next question.
I just wanted to jump in with Leah's point too about the people are really uncomfortable, I think, to talk about the religious piece. I know, or quickly to maybe push it into the multicultural kind of bucket. I remember there was, a few years ago, I think there was a club, we approved clubs at the board, and there was, I don't remember what religion, but there was some club that was looking to be approved for the high school. And, we usually don't have much discussion unless people have questions about the club. And I remember somebody asking, doesn't the high school already have a multicultural club? And, which may have been true, but if I remember correctly, there were other religious clubs already that had existed. So sometimes when I think when it's not the majority religion, it's easy to just push that aside to, well, that just belongs in that bucket. And, we don't have to worry about that.
I got the names in here.
Just something to notice.
Well, thank you. That is the perfect transition right there. The idea of it's not the majority, just kind of goes into some buckets. And we see that actually happening with a lot of things. So over the past few months, we've looked at different forms of identity and how intersectionality works. Really, the idea that we are more than a single identity, and the convergence of those identities plays a role in shaping our lived experience. And so on page 111, the first pause and reflect question is where I'd like for us to wrap this part before we go into a look at the calendar, which is directly related to this. But the question that I want to focus on, because it's a 3-point bullet, but it says, What other areas of identity and diversity stand in tension to religious beliefs in your experience? And that's a big one to unpack. Really want to focus on that aspect of the question, but for folks who don't have the book, I'll just share what the other parts of it are. What does it look like to allow a diversity of religious beliefs and expressions, protect students' right to safety, religious freedom, and access, but not promote or favor any particular religion or religious view in these instances? Mike Laster.
In my experience, the biggest challenge is for students who are LGBTQ plus and who are aligned with their religious belief, who do not accept that sexual identity.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Christina, do you still have your hand up? Want to share?
I mean, to piggyback, not just students who themselves align with Christianity and are a part of the LGBTQ community, but also students who are interacting with people who are Christian and don't agree with the acceptance of the LGBTQ community is a pretty significant issue I see for students. Having conversations with their classmates who say, well, my religion says that you're evil or wrong or shouldn't exist, or all the other numerous ways of incarnating that statement.
Thank you. Mike?
I actually misspoke because it might not just be Christianity. There might be other religious philosophies that have a difference of opinion on sexual identity. So I'd like to correct myself.
Thank you. And I do think you just said religious beliefs at first. But yes, thank you. Other folks, and I know this is a loaded one. I went for hard questions this month. Tibisai and then Maxine.
So individuals that look a certain nationality and are perceived to be a specific religion. So someone whose features are more Arab, and then people assuming that they're automatically a Muslim, and even people who may not appear to be Muslim but are, right? So like appearance and people's thought processes around how appearance denotes that somebody is a part of a particular religious group, and people not understanding the nuances enough of different parts of the world and making a lot of assumptions that can also cause a lot of tension.
Absolutely. And thank you. Maxine?
I was literally going to say the same exact thing. I've been told like so many times, like, oh, you don't look Jewish, and it's like, religion is not a race. Like, there's no and it's just like I've had like my experience as like a Jewish person be like dismissed because I don't look Jewish, and it's like religion doesn't have a look. So I think that it's like, I think that's like a big thing with like my identity with religion, and then like my identity is also like a person of color who maybe doesn't fit like your definition of what I should look like.
Intersectionality, folks. Yeah. Yes. Joe?
To piggyback on what Maxine said, that also comes with your name as well. That's not a name of a certain religion.
Amy?
Yeah, I'll add also the assumptions that people make about what it means to be a particular religion, what that means you celebrate, what that means you don't, and how and in what ways you celebrate those things. Because I think that, maybe there are some traditions that people know and learn, but I think oftentimes people express their religion differently. But I think there are a lot of assumptions made once you learn what religion somebody is or believes in.
Absolutely. And before we go to the calendar, just one last thing. I want us to think about this too from, although in the curveball sense, when we think of that words, that phrase really standing in tension, I think immediately we think of negative tensions. What might some positive tensions be between religious identities and other identities? Kim?
I'm going to throw you for a loop on this one. Okay, so the LGBTQ plus, for some reason lately, I seem to have come into a huge influx of LGBTQ plus that are Wiccan, and it is a religion, and it has actually empowered them to feel better about themselves and stronger, and that they have a voice. And that's, I'm sorry, when you said that, that was the first thought that came into my mind. But just kind of those is what we would call the outside religions that people don't really think about. I'm hearing a lot lately, because we've been doing our own little research project here at the house with these kind of outlier religions and how they're promoting just self-worth and advocacy. And so it's been a positive, although it's different. So.
Thank you for sharing that. Personally, I didn't know that. Thank you. Leah?
I'm not sure this exactly answers your question, but it popped into my head as we're talking about this. I'm going to blank on the name, but this week a rabbi died right around Martin Luther King Day, who was one of the most arrested rabbis with Dr. Martin Luther King. He was involved in many of his protests and often went to jail with him. And so I was reading an interesting article about his life, and he said, at a student speech, he said something to the effect of, well, how could I have set out the civil rights movement? I was Jewish. And he was saying he saw the need for that alliance, and there's really a lot of interesting alliances between blacks and Jews in the civil rights movement that people don't know about nowadays, but we're very strong. Like you see the picture of Martin Luther King crossing the bridge with Wood Rabbi on one side of him and Joe Lewis on the other. So it points out to me that it's just one more way. It's another avenue for coalition building among. That we really can weave a lot of alliances that people might not initially think are allied groups, but that can be a lot of strength.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point. I'll kind of enter myself into the conversation here, and I would also posit that there's been a lot of intersection with civil rights and with women. Something that, going back to, putting on my history teacher hat, at the forefront of nearly every, if not every single major social movement, women have been at the forefront of it. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. That, when we think about really name your societal change, name your benefit that happened, women have had a role in it. And I think that one of the travesties that we as a society do is far too often the heroes that emerge from these movements are not women. And the figureheads that emerge are not women, despite women doing much of the organizing, much of the campaigning, much of the broadcasting. I don't want to step on the high horse, but I just think that that's something that really kind of plays a role in this. We see this intersection very much with religion, with civil rights. We see this intersection with really any sort of movement. I'll do the fulcrum for just anyone else, if anyone has any last thoughts on this before we go to the calendar to the side. And that'll kind of close out our look at the learning component.
I thought of a positive tension being, some of the roots of most religions are really rooted in social justice norms, and looking at individuals that are not at the top tier, people who are oppressed and bringing some sort of understanding and humanizing each other. A lot of humanizing each other. It's like if you look in every religion, there is a fundamental base layer for treating people with respect, treating yourself with respect. So I say this because I saw Jesus as my first activist role model, being raised very Catholic and actually transitioning into a Jehovah's Witness for a while in my family. And I just saw a lot of those underpinnings of how I wanted to live my life being brought into my life through religion, and just being those tenets of treating people how you want to be treated, like that, just that baseline. So I think there's some positive tension in activism and social justice and fighting for our basic human rights that you can find in a lot of different religions.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And thank you very much, Lee, for sharing that article for folks to be able to grab from here. At this point, we'll go back to our calendar, so I'll turn it back over to Amy and to Dr. Wiles.
Thanks, Matt. Dr. Wiles, I'm going to turn it over to you to give a review of the calendar development process, so that we can provide some input on the draft that was attached to our agenda tonight.
Good evening, everybody. I'm just, reflecting back on the chapter we just reviewed, and disrupting the school calendar is one of the sections of this chapter that we read. So I think it's just timely that we have this conversation tonight. Before I talk about kind of the process that we worked through to develop the calendar for the subsequent year, I just want to share that one of the reasons why the calendar is before you tonight is a reflection of active student voices who wanted us to take a look at our calendar for next year. So Mr. Pinchina and I were invited to a meeting of the Muslim Student Association to talk about the possibility of Eid, one of the Muslim holidays, being recognized in our school calendar. And so we went, it was a couple weeks ago, and we're scheduled to come back to talk with that group next week. And it just kind of underscored some of the challenges or the tensions that go into putting together a school calendar. And I'm hopeful that we can have this discussion among this group. But kind of to understand the complexities of putting together the calendar, I thought I would just frame kind of the work that happens behind the scenes before we even get to it, and some of the competing needs that we have to address when we put the calendar together. So let me start with the fact that the calendars, the very first draft of our calendar is actually done across a multi-county section of New York State, including by the BOCES regions, including Capital Region BOCES, Washington, Warren BOCES, Herkimer BOCES, Questar BOCES, because we're trying to create a calendar that is consistent across wide areas of our geography, because we have students who attend programs that cross over those lines. And we don't want to have days of in and out of session that don't match, so that students are losing out on opportunities for instruction. So early in the school year, leaders from those regions start talking about, well, what would the subsequent school calendar look like? And they map out, the likely first day of school, and when will the December holiday fall, and what about the February break, and what about the April break, and what about the last day of school? So that big framework is laid out. And then there is the requirement that every school district have 180 days of instruction for students. And it's an arbitrary number, I suppose, but if we don't have 180 days of school, it actually affects the amount of state aid we receive on any given day. So, for example, in Guilderland, for every day that we would fall beneath 180, the amount of aid deducted is the equivalent of an entire teacher's salary for a year. So if we only had 179 days one year, we would lose about $86,000. So we have to be very careful to make sure we have 180 days. So once we figure out what the broader region is doing, and then we map out the 180 days, then individual school districts start looking at what are the customs, the needs of its community that need to be accommodated in the calendar, and then also what are the contractual parameters that we have to consider as well. So there are many layers of what we can do and what we can't do to get down to a draft calendar. So the calendar that's included in your materials tonight has been through at least the first two of those levels. So the big regional piece has been worked out. We're looking at starting school the same day as every school around the whole region. We figured out the 180 days. And we've built in the holidays that we have typically recognized. So we recognize Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur in September. We build in Good Friday. We've now included Juneteenth, which is new last year. And then a tremendously powerful tradition in our district is to have the Wednesday before Thanksgiving off. It's called Pi Day, which I had never heard of before I came to Guilderland. So the calendar you have gets us to 180 days, has us start school with everybody else, and has us end school with everybody else. It recognizes all of the holidays and builds in that Wednesday before Thanksgiving. It does not recognize Eid, which I've done a little research here, which I believe in 2023, and maybe the students who are going to meet with next week, Matt, will correct me, but I believe that it starts on sundown on Friday, April 21st, and the holiday is actually Saturday, April 22nd. So it would not necessarily result in an additional day off. If it did, and if we wanted to think about including it, we would have to find another day someplace else in the calendar to give back. Whether it's, and I'm just putting days out here, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, Good Friday, a day from February break. All of those things would have to be talked about. So it's not a simple enterprise. Our next step with this calendar, we're really interested in your feedback tonight. Our next step is to take this calendar to numerous stakeholder groups and get their feedback before we bring it back to the Board of Education. So I know that was a lot of preamble, but there's a lot that goes into it that's important to contextualize kind of the work on it. So I'll stop talking and open it up to the group and to any questions. Joe, and then Kelly, and then Elizabeth.
Not so much a question, but just to add in there, some of the testing dates are dictated by the state as opposed to the individual district, like regions, and then also that the calendars being similar around here. You mentioned the academic programming in different areas, but also to have any kind of a sports schedule, districts have to more or less adhere to the same, as well. Just saying it's even more complicated, right?
True enough. Good point, Joe. Kelly, and then Elizabeth.
This is the first I've heard of Pi Day in my
44 years. What, can someone explain a little bit to me? Is it just a family-centric day before Thanksgiving, or what?
I've never heard of that either.
Well, it's the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, and the idea is that people are gathering for the holidays, and it gives an extra day to get ready for that. And for those who actually bake pies, I guess that would be the day that you do it. I for one can say that I purchased them, but that's just me. And yes, March 14th is the other pie day of the year. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
So I just wanted to say, because there may be people in the community that could be watching this, that could be thinking, why are these people so concerned about all these other religions? We should be more concerned about Christianity and the way our country is breaking down and the nuclear family is going to hell, and everybody, I'm just thinking I'm thinking of these voices that I imagine in our community who are thinking, what do we care about Wiccans? Who cares about them? Let's go back to just worrying about Christian white people. And I wanted to just point out that in this book, the reason why we're doing all this is because it's based in the United States Constitution, where it says on the first page of this chapter, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So why we're doing this is because of the United States Constitution, which tells us that a public entity like a school cannot advocate for any particular religion over any other one. It can educate people about religions, but it can't promote any of them. So that's why we're doing all this. So I'd be in favor of giving up one of the many Christian holidays that are already on the calendar and having Eid instead.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I see Barbara.
Yeah, I just wanted to give a little history on what you are now calling Pie Day. Over the years, we heard from hundreds and hundreds of parents that travel on Thanksgiving. Is, I guess, from what I understand, the most highly traveled day, even over Christmas or Labor Day or any of the other holidays. And it was, in a sense, in response to parents asking, could we have Wednesday off? And I know after we did it, a number of other school districts in the area, I believe, also now have Wednesday off. So it wasn't called Pie Day, but it was in response to parent requests that said that, we're going to visit family and this would be a nice accommodation.
One of the points, and Matt, maybe you want to jump in here too, that I think we heard from the students in MSA was not necessarily having a day on the calendar, but, and maybe this goes to Maxine's point from earlier, having a better sense that other people in our school community understand, respect, and give space to a recognition that this is a really holy time for a significant number of our students who are fasting all day long, who's are trying to balance a very holy portion of their life during the rigors of a school day and all that goes with that. So some of what I think they're advocating for, and we'll hear more on the 25th, is how can people become less indifferent to what their lived experience is? Matt, and then Amy.
Yeah, so I definitely want to echo that. That's 100% the sentiment that I've understood too. And one of the things that's come forward too is the notion that maybe there's the idea, okay, you can take this as a day off, but that doesn't necessarily negate things like if there were to be a test, you still have to eventually make that up. So it's a cultural understanding of what that means, and this extends into multiple areas, like during Ramadan. We're providing accommodations for students in terms of locations where they might be other than the cafeteria. And so that it's not as much of a hands-off approach as it's been. So the sense I've gotten from a lot of students is not that we are doing something that is negative or hurting students, but the problem is that we're not doing things that are helpful or supportive, certain, but at least not to the extent that we can surrounding Ramadan and surrounding Eid in particular. So this is definitely an important area to look at and to consider. One, obviously, given the chapter that we just read, but two, just on a basic human level, where one of the things that our district strives to do is to support students in all the areas that they're growing in and learning in. And when students are in a time where it is that only month that can happen during any point in the year, this impacts a number of things, be it, it could be like SATs, it can be tests, it can be midterms, sports, and in terms of trials, we go back to time trials, all these different things can happen, and students are doing this while fasting. So I think it's just something that's very important for us to credence to and to make sure that we acknowledge, and not just in a verbal way, but in word and in deed.
Go ahead, Amy.
Sure. I would add, this makes me think about the ways in which we as a district recognize and celebrate holidays. So having them on our at-a-glance calendar and taking them as a day off of school is one way that our district recognizes and celebrates holidays. Another way that we do that is we have a 12-month page per month calendar that gets sent out with the different holidays, variety of holidays being recognized on that calendar. But then there are also other ways that we as an entire district or maybe individual schools recognize holidays, and you might say accommodate for holidays or just celebrate or recognize them in general. And so I think the at-a-glance, actual school calendar is one part of the discussion, and I think a secondary discussion is how we recognize holidays, whether they're religious holidays or non-religious holidays, and then where and how we communicate that recognition.
So kind of a radical idea, although not everywhere in New York State, is the notion of rethinking the February break. So as we have new holidays added throughout the year, so this year we're adding Juneteenth. Some of our colleague districts downstate have added Eid. There's talk about having Election Day as a holiday. If that all were to come into play and we're still held to 180 days of instruction, many have looked at the February break to say, why are we doing this? So that conversation has not taken hold in the greater capital district at all. And yes, Barbara's point was all about the energy crisis, but it's become a strong tradition. Many people travel in February, so giving it up would be, would not necessarily be well received by all. Yes, Mirzad, we really do learn something every day. It's the beauty of all of this. So anyway, I'm really open to your feedback, and we do need to have the calendar adopted. Usually we do it in February, early March at the latest. We're going to be reaching out to other stakeholder groups. Matt and I will be talking with MSA next Tuesday. So your comments and thoughts are very welcome, both specific to this calendar, but also to calendar development in general.
Thanks, Dr. Miles. Mike, go ahead.
The disruption of having that conversation, we would have to make sure we do that in a long sort of timeline, because districts upstate are not used to not having February break. So if, as a committee, we want to go there, we just need to take our time.
I'll point out that we regularly get calls in the district office. When will the breaks be for the year out? Because people are booking vacations. Like, when will you get that calendar done? Is the question.
Now, that's also an actionable item for disruption.
Yes. Maxine, then Seema, and then I'll turn it back to Amy.
I totally am on board with like disrupting things, but as a student, I hear like February break and like my heart rate like jumps. I'm like, you're trying to take like my days off away. Like, what are you doing? So like the logistics of that, I think, like Mr. Laster said, like it would have to be really slow, and then also like I'm wondering because like I know like. For me, like this stretch from like December until February break is like pretty brutal academically. I didn't want to say it, but
What year are you, Maxine?
2023. But like this stretch is like pretty rigorous academically, and I think that like that would definitely be like something that would have to be taken slowly, and then like also like I'm like wondering if like it's just like I didn't realize how like you said like a whole teacher's salary for a day, like that's crazy to me. Like I didn't realize like the balance of it. So I totally understand how this is like a really complicated process also.
Seema, then Kelly.
Yeah, I was gonna say I respect and I think I mentioned it when we talked about this for the agenda that it's I respect that it's super complicated to put together because of state tests and the contractual piece and all of that stuff. At the same time, I'm not touching February breaks, so don't put that out there. But the idea that
Now they're talking about
we're talking about religious holidays, and not that it matters, but I'm Catholic. To not consider another religious holiday and to consider Pi Day, which is like a made up day, to be more important. And I get it, like, you know, I get the family part and I get the travel part. It just seems kind of insane to me. And I'll just say that there's a bunch of districts around us that don't have that Wednesday off. I'm not saying that we should go that way. I'm just saying that to say that that's untouchable is, I think, that would be unfair to say we can't even have that discussion. And this is not to anybody on here, this is anybody who's watching and thinking that, because I know there are people thinking that.
Go ahead, Kelly. You're muted, Kelly.
Thanks. Sorry. Yeah, Seema touched on a lot of the things I was going to comment on. That like, here we are talking about people's, you know, heartfelt religions and things that we can make an accommodation for. You know, when I travel with my family for a vacation or whatever, I take my child out of school, and that's my choice. You know, it's the Pi Day. It's a little bit inconsequential, I guess you could say, for me when we're talking about something much more significant like a religious holiday that we could very easily put into the schedule. Maybe unpopular in a lot of places, but I think it's a really valid argument to have a discussion around. Maybe unpopular, but it might be the right thing to take a look at.
Amy, I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I saw Leah's question about is that why some parts start so much earlier? I mean, that's part of why, but another reason is that we have the end of our school year is pretty much dictated by the New York State Regents exams, and so we're not as flexible at the end of the year, and so we kind of count 180 days back, whereas other parts of the country, especially places where it gets really hot, a bit earlier. They end earlier and started earlier, just because of those reasons. But yeah, the traditional schedule around here, and I know we talked a bit about the coordination piece of it with different programs, not just academics but athletics, and yeah, there's a lot of reasons why our calendar is the way it is. So if anybody has any further comments or questions related to the calendar, feel free to send them to Dr. Wiles or to Matt. Thanks everybody for the robust discussion tonight. We really went over a lot. And had
thanks for the robust discussion.
Had a lot of great topics tonight. Anybody want to move to adjourn the meeting tonight? Thanks, Maxine. Second, Nora. All right. Have a great night, everyone.
She's inside my office. Yeah, she was here.